Hey everyone, so today I'm going to be talking about the proper definitions of right and left-wing thought in regards to political philosophy. So often these days we think of left and right-wing in regards to the two-party system in the United States, so the Democratic Party representing left-wing thought and the Republican Party representing right-wing thought, when in reality, in a lot of ways, both these parties are actually rooted in left-wing thought. So the proper definition of right and left wing goes all the way back to the French Revolution. Generally speaking, right wing meant on the right side of the king. At the time, it was the monarch Louis XVI. And left wing meant on the left-hand side of the monarch. So that represented the revolutionaries and Republicans who were fighting to overthrow the monarchy. And what we get from this essentially is the difference of political systems which favor hierarchy based on power and those based on mass rule. So essentially, the monarchists supported hierarchy, while the people on the left-hand side, the leftists, so to speak, the revolutionaries and Republicans, favored more or less mass rule. So that's either direct democracy, or if you're a Republican, that's representative democracy. And it's important to delineate the proper definitions of both right and left wing, because too often today we see the Republican Party as the representative of right-wing thought, when in reality it really isn't. And I'm going to explain why. So when we think of hierarchy versus mass rule, this really goes back down to the Enlightenment. So it's pre- and post-Enlightenment thought. Pre-Enlightenment, generally speaking, we had monarchies and different forms of autocracy. And within these autocracies and monarchies, you had a hierarchy of rule. And within the feudal system, for example, you had kings who delegated to lords, who delegated to knights, and in different forms of autocracy, take the Roman Empire, for example, though it somewhat functioned as a representative republic for its early history before it became the empire, and afterwards they still retained the Senate, it was, generally speaking, a meritocratic autocracy where, for the most part, from the political elite, the most powerful would eventually become the emperor. Now, of course, you have corruption, and sometimes you have people picking their own sons, but it was supposed to operate as a sort of meritocratic imperial system. Now, when we delineate right and left-wing thought, and we're talking about the Enlightenment, we have to define what exactly the Enlightenment means in regards to right and left-wing thought. So like I said, left-wing thought is mass rule. Before the Enlightenment, you didn't have this egalitarian idea that all people were created equal. What you had was the idea that certain people were gifted by nature with the divine right to rule. In the Catholic kingdoms of Christendom, you had the idea that each king was picked by God to be a representative of God on earth, and their authority was pretty much absolute, besides having to do certain tasks for the Pope. For example, if the Pope called a crusade, you fight in the crusade. If the Pope asked for specific taxes for the Vatican, you would provide these taxes. But for the most part, the king was the representative of God on earth, ruling their respective kingdoms, as well as for them, kind of retaining this relationship with the Pope. The Pope was, for the most part, supposed to be the representative of God on earth in terms of being in charge of the church, and he technically was supposed to be above the kings in the hierarchy, but obviously you have a lot of friction. For example, the Holy Roman Empire didn't get along with the Pope oftentimes, and even set up anti-popes, setting up their own popes to contend against the Vatican. So you have a lot of conflict when it comes to this. But essentially, the difference in terms of right and left-wing thought goes back to the Enlightenment. During the Enlightenment, you have, like I said, this idea that all men are created equal, that all people, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of anything else, have to have an equal representation in power, that it is their, let's say, God-given rights, and in the Bible and in Christian doctrine, you do have this idea that all men are created equal under God, right? So they kind of do take from Christianity with this concept of egalitarianism. However, what we end up seeing is something a little bit different. Essentially, I would say that one of the main motivations of the Enlightenment was to create a system where people that were not of the nobility could find ways to rise up through the ranks of society, or basically create an even playing field for most people within a nation. So, for example, from the Enlightenment, you actually get nationalism, you get liberalism, eventually you even get Marxism. You have all these different systems of thought which go from the old system of feudalism, the old system of a ruler who is divine, with divine right to rule, picked by God, to everybody is equal and everybody has the ability to rise up up through the ranks. Now, the idea of meritocracy isn't necessarily an Enlightenment idea. If we go back to the origins of monarchies, you do kind of see this relationship of meritocracy in the sense that the strongest were able to conquer and establish themselves at the top of a hierarchy and hence become those kings. So in the state of nature, the most powerful survive, the strongest and smartest survive and conquer the weak and the unintelligent, let's say. Those who are not smart, those who are not strong get conquered by the strong and intelligent. And that's essentially what happened throughout human history. Now, this kind of goes back to the whole idea of pastoral versus sedentary people. You have these different pastoral tribes made up of nomadic herdsmen who herded goats, and they had lots of horses, and they were constantly on the move. And what this means for them is they're much more hardy and tough because they're constantly moving. They don't have a steady stream of food the way that the sedentary people who had agriculture could constantly be farming and have relatively steady stream of food. The nomadic people had to hunt. They had to protect their herds against other nomadic tribes who might come and steal that from them. You kind of see this idea brought up in Carol Quigley's Evolution of Civilizations, which I like to bring up a lot. You also see this through Constant Alimaru, also known as Bronze Age pervert, in both Bronze Age mindset and also selective breeding, the birth of philosophy. It's this idea that the pastoral tribes created stronger individuals because they had to be tougher. They had to know how to fight to defend what they had, because it's a lot harder to defend cattle and livestock, because you can't just build a stone wall protecting your livestock. You had to constantly be moving your livestock to find better pastures to graze. You had to find better pastures for those animals to eat grass from. So you couldn't just stay in the same place the way that the sedentary peoples could. You couldn't just build up walls to defend your possessions. You had to fight for it. So they were stronger in the terms of actually knowing how to fight and having to defend themselves. They're also physically stronger, not only because of their climate, which was hardier and made them stronger. They literally had to have more calories in their body because a lot of times it was colder, or they didn't have as much access to food because they were hunter-gatherers. So they had to be able to retain more calories, so they're generally larger. They were eating a primarily protein-rich diet of dairy and meat. So, of course, they had stronger muscles compared to the sedentary people. So they developed stronger. So if you think about meritocracy in a sense, the idea that, survival of the fittest, the strongest in nature survives. And this is kind of what happened with your pastoral peoples who eventually became the ruling classes in Europe and throughout the world. They were stronger physically. They had to be hardier. They had to be craftier because they're constantly at war. And this led them to being strong enough to overtake the sedentary peoples. Now, whereas the pastoral peoples were more warlike, they were patriarchal, they generally followed men, they had warlike gods and guttural languages. The sedentary peoples were more peaceful, they were matriarchal, they worshipped fertility gods because their livelihood came from agriculture. It came from growing grain and therefore having a grain-based diet. Now what this means is, because of what they worship, they're obviously generally more peaceful. They're also weaker and smaller because a grain-based diet it results in weaker bone and lower bone density. It results in lower muscle density. They're generally going to be shorter and weaker and not as strong as those pastoral people who had a primarily protein-rich diet of meat and dairy. So what happens is these nomadic pastoral people who generally come from the steppe regions, so that's sort of Eurasian area like the Caucasus and modern-day Kazakhstan, Mongolia, these people came down, the Iron Age invaders, and they swept through Europe, they swept through Mesopotamia, and they defeated the sedentary agricultural peoples because they were more warlike, they were physically stronger, they were craftier, they were smarter because they had to constantly think about how to maintain their survival in such a hardy environment. So that, of course, they went in and they conquered the sedentary peoples. In Europe, Bronze Age Pervert talks about the idea of the longhouse. In these matriarchal societies, you have a society in which sort of the masculine virtues of courage and warfare are discouraged because it's not as necessary, because they're sedentary, because they're peaceful. They don't need strong men, so generally they end up worshiping like I said, fertility gods, which are matriarchal because they get their livelihood from the earth, from the ground. So you kind of think of this idea of softness and peacefulness, and it gives you this matriarchal approach. Whereas the warlike peoples of the steppe had to rely on these masculine virtues of courage and sacrifice and warfare because it was necessary for their survival. And what of course happens is these pastoral peoples end up sweeping in and conquering all the sedentary agricultural peoples. And the reason I bring this up is those people eventually became the ruling classes of the different kingdoms of Europe. So the origins of aristocracy is the warrior elite. It's the warriors who conquered the weaker peoples and put themselves at the top of the hierarchy. So you do have this idea of meritocracy of nature early on in terms of the most capable, strongest, intelligent people surviving over the weaker and unintelligent. However, over time, especially once you get to the point of the French Revolution, you see the aristocracy go from this strong, hardy warrior elite during the medieval era, for example. It was the knights and the nobility that were fighting wars, not the lower classes. And you go from that to a more bourgeois approach to aristocracy. The aristocracy is now relatively lazy. They have lots of money because they own lots of land, but they're not really working that hard. They're not making up the brunt of the military. They're not going and fighting the wars because with the advent of gunpowder, the masses can now fight wars. Because in the past, to learn the way of the bow, the way of the sword, the way of horsemanship, first of all, it cost a lot of money to supply them with armor, supply them with horses, to train them. It took a lot of time. It took like 10 years to learn how to shoot a bow and arrow to the point that you were going to be able to accurately shoot down knights in battle. And you go from that to the rifle, which you can pretty much learn how to shoot relatively well in like 3 weeks. For most military basic training, rifle training is like maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks for like some of the more elite branches like the Marine Corps or the Army. But you don't really spend a lot of time learning how to shoot a firearm because it's relatively easy to learn. And what this means is this responsibility of warfare goes from the upper classes to everybody. And when everyone can wage war, the power dynamics shift drastically. And you go from having an aristocracy based on strong, virile warriors to lazy bourgeois aristocrats who are living off the labor of the lower classes. And that's where you sort of get this weird shift from the original, like we said, right-wing thought of natural power-based hierarchies to this idea of, well, look at all the aristocrats. They're not doing anything. Why should they rule? And then the masses feel entitled to rule, right? So this difference of right and left wing kind of stems from that. It stems from what is more or less a metaphysical power-based hierarchy that stems from the material. Because we do see the material reason for these peoples becoming the aristocrats were because they were great warriors. They were physically stronger because they were pastoral, they were taller, they were smarter. So of course, the material sense, this is why they're in the hierarchy. They were smarter and they were stronger. But this turns into something metaphysical. You get metaphysical doctrines rooted in the material. So for example, the idea of divine right to rule by these warrior elites, because the material sense they were able to conquer, they also adopted metaphysical doctrines to maintain their power. They said, well, actually, it's because the gods say so. That's why we can rule. We have earned our right to rule because the gods made us strong. They made you weak. We're going to conquer you and subjugate you, right? So this idea of natural hierarchy, which comes from these material strengths and intelligence, and then it sort of becomes something more metaphysical. It's kind of like you have an artist with like lots of colors at his disposal. And at first they're just colors, but when you add these colors together, you can create a beautiful painting, and the painting ends up being superior to the sum of its parts. Each color on its own, even when added together, doesn't amount to the beauty of that painting, and that's sort of when the painting becomes something metaphysical. So the same phenomena can be observed in terms of right-wing power structures and why this is right-wing. It's the natural hierarchy. Now, of course, by the time the French Revolution comes, like I said, it's been distorted. It is an abstraction of what it originally was. Originally, the Frankish invaders, who eventually became Charlemagne and became these great French warrior kings, ends up being Louis XVI, nothing really to brag about, a fat, lazy aristocrat who was really good for nothing. So you go from these power-based hierarchy to the bourgeois. And liberalism capitalizes on this because they say, look at the elites. They're fat and lazy and they're not doing anything. Why should they be in charge? Because what happens is the elite grow decadent and they lose the faith of the people, especially when they start to pass on the responsibility for warfare to the lower classes. Now the lower classes have the guns, they have the power. Why should they follow the elites? So that's sort of this thing that happens, and why you go from power-based hierarchies, natural-based hierarchies of like the warrior or priestly classes. For example, in India, in the caste system, you have the priestly and warrior classes at the top. You go from that to mass rule, which is basically liberal thought, this idea that all men are created equal. And then you also get economic liberalism, laissez-faire liberalism. We often look at the Republican Party today, which is generally laissez-faire, free market, capitalist, and we think that's right-wing. Capitalism is right-wing. But in reality, it's really neither right nor left-wing, because the idea behind capitalism is essentially the creation of economically based social hierarchies. Those with the most money, those with the ability to manipulate finances and make money are going to be the most powerful. So you go from the warrior, priestly elites to these economic elites. And that's not really right or left wing necessarily. However, the idea of egalitarianism, which is left wing, the idea that all men are created equal, kind of factors into capitalism. You have guys like Adam Smith and all these different liberal thinkers who say, hey, here's a way where we can have a power structure which is meritocratic, which allows the masses to rise, and it's going to be free market capitalism. If you put in enough work, you can make money, and you can eventually raise your social standing. That's the whole theory of free market capitalism. And that's why free market capitalism, while it's neither left nor right-wing, it's certainly not right-wing. So when they talk about fiscal conservatism being a right-wing train of thought, it really isn't, because in fact it really leads to the destruction of what is truly right-wing philosophy, which is power-based natural hierarchies where the strongest and most capable and smartest end up at the top. Now the idea is that with an economic system of like liberal capitalist democracies, the idea is that the smartest people will rise up because the smartest people are going to make the most money, right? But it doesn't always end up that way. And that's where you have the skewed idea that capitalism automatically equals right-wing thought, whereas it's really at the center and it could be applied to both right-wing thought or left-wing thought, but it's not purely right-wing and it's not purely left-wing either, but it can benefit left-wing thought absolutely with what I described there. So like I said, essentially what is right-wing is these almost metaphysical power-based hierarchies. You go from the material reason for these hierarchies, which is their strength and intelligence, and it goes to metaphysical doctrines. We are chosen by God. If you look at like Roman or basically Hellenic religions or pagan Norse religions, there's always this warlike element of we are chosen by the gods. If we are strong, if we are good warriors, the gods chose us to be good warriors. So it goes from the fact that their environment probably led to them being stronger. They come from those pastoral warlike tribes and they emigrate and settle in all these different lands. It goes from that, the fact that they're naturally stronger because they eat more meat, they have more dairy, and they're smarter because they have to constantly think about how to defend their possessions. It goes from that to let's create a metaphysical doctrine to explain why we're so great, right? So that's where you get all these religions, mainly pagan religions, that emphasize power. And it's an important thing to note because you go from that and you go from that. Oh, my light went off for a second. You go from that and then you end up with this more sort of idea of egalitarianism, which in a lot of ways is rooted in Christian doctrine, this idea that all men are created equal under God. So you go from the idea that we are chosen by the gods to conquer to Christianity, which puts everyone on an even playing field. And even if you look at the Beatitudes, for example, it's like, blessed are the poor, for they will inherit the kingdom of God. It's this idea that all people, regardless of strength, regardless of power, can go into heaven. And this is what Nietzsche will call a slave morality. He describes it as a slave morality because this idea that the lowest of the low can still receive eternal rewards. And his theory is that Christian doctrine kind of comes from this idea of being oppressed and trying to find a way to justify or make your oppression worth it. Like, you are being oppressed for a reason. If you're oppressed in this life and you're constantly beaten down by those who are stronger, you will actually be rewarded in the afterlife, and those people who oppressed you will be punished. So that's where this idea comes from, and that's why Nietzsche calls it the slave morality. It's a morality based on those who were oppressed and who were made to be, for the most part, slaves, essentially. And that's sort of where this idea comes from. And I think that does factor into left-wing philosophy and left-wing thought. It's almost this idea of the cult of victimhood, right? Like, so many times today, in terms of left-wing thought, you see people that like to align themselves with sort of minority opinions. Like, you want to be part of that minority identity. I'm not even talking about ethnically, because that's like barely a fraction of it, really. When you really look into it, a lot of it has to do with like all these different gender identities, for example, or social justice movements, specific like political positions that people take that are generally representative of oppressed peoples, right? It's this idea of being oppressed as a virtue, right? Like, I don't want to be the conqueror. Being the conqueror is wrong. And that's really this idea of left-wing philosophy. It's the idea that being a conqueror is wrong. It's this idea that we're all created equal, and infringing on their freedom, that's another thing. Left-wing thought is this idea of inherent freedom. Infringing upon that is wrong, whereas the more right-wing thought is, well, I'm strong, I'm powerful, I come from this pastoral warlike tribe. I'm going to go conquer the weaker, longhouse people. I'm going to go into Mesopotamia and chop the heads off of these little farmers and subjugate them, right? That's where that idea comes from. And you see different philosophers sort of representing right and left-wing thought. I would say, for the most part, Thomas Hobbes is actually a very right-wing philosopher. He's a very right-wing thinker for the reason of the whole concept of the Leviathan, that nature is chaotic, nature is evil, nature is constantly killing the smaller peoples. It's constantly killing the weaker peoples who can't survive, and that's why you need the state, you need the government to ensure the survival of the people. So this idea that nature is chaotic, the strongest survive in nature. It's this sort of admission of that. That's the natural way of things. Strongest survive. Whereas you have guys like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's actually a thinker around the time of the French Revolution, who believed the state of nature was peaceful, that without artificial concepts like money, without artificial hierarchies, you don't actually have conflict between humans. He believed in the state of nature, humans didn't go to war, and that they were relatively peaceful because they didn't have these abstract notions of possession and property to fight over. I, of course, disagree with that. I generally would take Thomas Hobbes' approach. And then in terms of right-wing philosophy, you have early thinkers such as Plato, who believed that, he believed in the philosopher king. He believed in the philosopher king state, where a certain class of people who were smarter and stronger, those born of gold, as you would call it, would be at the top of the hierarchy. They would be the guardians, the political elite who ruled this republic, right? Because the book Republic by Plato is essentially creating his ideal state in which the philosopher kings and the guardians and these political elite, these smart people who are gifted by nature, are in the top of the hierarchy. So it kind of relates to all these other things we talked about earlier, natural power-based hierarchies based on strength and based on intelligence, based on capabilities. And of course, you have guys like Nietzsche, who are radical aristocrats, who don't believe in mass rule, who believe that, slave moralities are not going to create the most ideal and beautiful societies, because if you regulate, if you sort of pass on the responsibility of governance, or you govern based on the wills of the lower classes, you're going to be going based on the will of those who don't necessarily want exceptional things. Because if you're from the lower classes, like we described with slave morality, you are generally going to be resentful of power because you yourself don't have power. You yourself are weaker. You don't have wealth. You don't have strength. So you're going to envy those with wealth and strength. So if you create a system which is based upon the rule of the masses, the rule of the lowest classes, exceptionalism and strength and power aren't going to be held as virtues. They're going to be held as evil. They're not going to be seen as good. They're going to be seen as bad. And that's sort of another hallmark of left-wing thought, and something that Nietzsche is highly critical of. Nietzsche was highly critical of things like the French Revolution. He was highly critical of things like socialist Marxist movements during his time, because he was born after Marx. So he was around for the time of Marxism and socialism, and he could kind of see the boiling, the slow boil, which would eventually become major Marxist revolutions after he died during the 20th century. And then you have guys like Julius Evola, traditionalist thinkers who believe in the original power-based hierarchies, sort of the priestly warrior classes and those below them that were a reflection of nature, where the strongest ended up in the positions of prominence, right? You have all these different right-wing philosophers. And of course, you also have left-wing philosophers. I mentioned Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You also have guys like Karl Marx who believe that that hierarchy is a construction of man's mind, that there is no such thing as real hierarchy, and it's all unnecessary, and that if we can get rid of hierarchy, and he was highly critical of hierarchy based on economics, which is something that a lot of right-wing thinkers completely agree with, right? Because I said capitalism is neither right nor left-wing. It can be manipulated to support either thought, right? But Marx was highly critical of economic social hierarchies. He believed that money kept people down, and that the manipulation of money would allow certain people to monopolize industries, certain people to have all the wealth and abuse and oppress the sort of subjugated proletariat, the lower classes. You have the bourgeois and the proletariat. Those with the means of production and those who produce. And he believed you got rid of classes, you got rid of the bourgeois, and you just had the proletariat and everyone was equal. You wouldn't have these unnecessary hierarchies and you wouldn't have this conflict. Again, I disagree with him. I believe that hierarchy is sort of inevitable, and it's something that's going to happen. You're going to have people who are more gifted than others, who are stronger and more capable. And this is reflected in the way we vote. Generally, we're supposed to vote for the most capable person. Now, the issue, and like what I said, the reason why capitalism isn't necessarily right-wing, because within a capitalist system, it isn't the most capable people that end up in charge. It's who can ever convince the masses, which also include lower classes who are operating under slave morality. It's whoever can manipulate them to vote for them. So if you have a lot of money, you can finance their campaign, you can buy more ads, you can sway public opinion, you control the newspapers, whatever, right? Like, through those means of manipulation, you can get the vote. You can get elected. So it's not necessarily a reflection of their capabilities so much as it is the reflection of their economic status. And this is something Marx is critical of. This is something guys like Evola are critical of. So you see from the left and right a critique of hyper-capitalist policies, right? Which is quite interesting. And I think it sort of disproves this idea that capitalism is inherently right-wing, because it's not. And you know, there'll be more that I'm going to talk about in terms of this thing. I'm going to make a video on why the Republican Party is not right-wing. But this is just a quick intro into the origins of right and left-wing thought, and why we have a lot of misconceptions of what is right-wing and what is left-wing. So just to kind of like briefly boil down the difference between right and left-wing. Right-wing thought is this idea that there are natural hierarchies based on an individual's power. Those with more power, which is a combination of like strength and intelligence, end up at the top and should end up at the top of the hierarchies. And there's left-wing thought, which believes that all people should have equal representation, and through equal representation, you'll have the best form of governance. So that's generally speaking the difference. It's not economics. It's not capitalism is right-wing, socialism is left-wing. You can have, you know, like fascism, for example. A lot of fascist movements were quite socialist economically, right? So economics is a separate issue in terms of the true meaning of right and left-wing thought in terms of philosophy. So that's just a quick video on to make delineating that. I want to delve into this more because I think there's so many misconceptions. There's so many misconceptions on what right-wing really means specifically. I think left-wing ideology is generally represented correctly in academia, though I would argue a lot of things that we consider right-wing are actually more left-wing or centrist. But I think right-wing thought is really not understood properly, and that's something I want to do through further videos. But anyway, I hope this was good, kind of quick introduction. I'm going to be making more videos on this topic, but as always, this is The Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the warrior philosophy. I'll see you next time.